Carlos was a student I taught at the first school where I taught in the South Bronx. The school was huge. It was in this gorgeous, gorgeous old, 1920s school building, back when they made schools like palaces, right? It was this huge high ceilings. You walk into the foyer and it had these gorgeous Tiffany lamps that were just Art Deco industrial, and it was all marble, and it was this beautiful building, and it was one of the worst schools in the state of New York. It was really poorly run. It had been through some pretty tough times. It wasn't getting the resources that it needed, and it was my first teaching job, and I knew nothing. I hadn't even really gone to grad school. I was in this grad school light program where we went to school at night after teaching all day, but I didn't really have that much preparation, and I started working in this school. It was a CTE school, and many of them led to students having union jobs right after graduating from high school, which is pretty different from SLA, where most of the coursework is heavily academic, and a lot of the students didn't particularly care about their English class, for example, which is where I was. I meet Carlos in my second year at this school. He is in my 10th grade English class. He's super quiet and really nerdy in a good way, but he's definitely into his things. He's into his video games. He's really smart, but it's not cool to be a good student at this school, so he never kind of lets on. He lays really low. He dresses a little bit differently from his classmates. He's not wearing the coolest stuff or anything like that. He kind of just has his button-down shirt that he would wear open, and he would have just a random band or something on a t-shirt underneath. He seems sort of grungier, I guess, than a lot of his classmates. Turns out this kid has a hilarious sense of humor, which I got not so much from his active participation in class, but from his written answers on things, or he would just be kind of sarcastic or snarky, and so I really liked him because I'm always just kind of drawn to kids with quirky senses of humor because I was one of them. And Carlos was just a great student that year, and that year he really found his friend group. Eventually, Carlos convinces me to start teaching an AP class for that school, and in that class we read The Great Gatsby. The main character dies at the end, and we read The Great Gatsby, and Carlos was really silent, and this was the last day of our discussion on Gatsby, and he was really silent, even though he had been just such a positive, good source of energy in our class at all times. That day he flipped out in class in a way that completely scared me, and I was just what happened? He pounded his hands on the table, and he's what's even the fucking point? Gatsby died in his fucking pool. And he just stormed out. And Carlos just had this flip out moment of what even is life that Gatsby dies in his pool? What are we doing here? And he just stormed out of the room. That same year, I got to participate in my first international trip with students. And we took 20 kids from the Bronx to Rome. And Carlos was on that trip. And him and a bunch of his friends that were also on that trip. And it was this week-long just transformative experience for all these kids, many of whom had never left New York City before, going to Rome, seeing them in the Colosseum, seeing them in all of these art museums, seeing them just walking around eating gelato and enjoying Italy was really, really, really cool.
Fast forward to last week, I get a text message from a student named Denzel, who was also in that same class with Carlos. Denzel sends me a photo that is all of them hanging out together in New York, and it said something just thought of you, the gang's all here, we're all just hanging out. And then earlier this week, because I do the Poland trip with students now, I sent out this mass email to everyone in my contacts list asking for donations for this trip and this program, and told everybody how awesome it is. And a couple of days ago, Ms. Pahomuk sent me the link to our GoFundMe page and said, check out all the donations that have come through since you sent your email. And I was scanning through them, and one of them was from Carlos, and he had made a donation to the Poland trip for students at SLA, and he had left a comment on it, something just passing it on or paying it forward.
It was so cool to receive Carlos's donation, not just because it's a contribution to our students and this trip that I think is really, really important, but also because it just made me think about how the trip to Rome must have been really impactful for the students that I took there, for him to donate now 10 years later or whatever to a trip that students he doesn't even know are going on, and a trip that, yes, I am a part of, but he and I haven't been in any sort of really close communication in a really long time. It's interesting for me to think about the ways that in teaching you don't always see the impact that you have on students, or the ways learning experiences matter to students until like years later, or sometimes you never really see it at all. And you often wonder like, oh, did this thing really even matter to them? Or does this work that I'm doing even matter sometimes? And you know, like you read a book and maybe a kid doesn't think about it till 10 years later or whatever. So it was really cool to see that the impact of that translated in a really direct way with that donation. I think that's really powerful.